Hello, and welcome to my presentation of the Volume Buddy. My name is Zach Fermanis, and this is the demo for CS683 of Spring 2017, and I am demoing Volume Buddy. A Volume Buddy, that we believe that a geofenced volume setter will result in a useful app experience, and we'll have success when users rate our app at 4 stars. So I'm going with a hypothesis-driven design concept where we take a hypothesis and we evaluate it. So the code repository is located here, as we have done all semester. So some of the key features of the app. Um, First of all, the app is protected by a login screen. So if you are one with kids like I am, um, you know that kids are quite adept at accessing your phone. So I wanted an app like this where you are adjusting volumes to be protected by a login screen. Future enhancements I would want to do maybe like a thumbprint um, sort of access, a little more user friendly protection than just like a traditional email password, which is what I'm using now. Other features are that users may add a location using the Google Maps UI. It's a Google Map activity. Using that activity, they can configure volumes for a given location. So they can set a location and configure a volume that the idea is once you enter that geofence, the volume would be set to your given volume. You can edit the existing locations, and as I mentioned before, when you create a location, you are also creating a geofence around that location, and so once you enter and exit, the transitions will occur. So basically, the way it works is when you enter a geofence, it changes your volume um, to the geofence to that location set volumes, and then when you exit that geofence, if you're not in another one, it puts it back to your original, your previous volumes. So some of the Android concepts and components that we use. So starting out, we used, we wanted to get diagnostic information, so we're using logging and logcat. In general, we're using activities and activity fragments. We're using intents, and we're actually passing arguments back and forth between the intents, and we're using pending intents, and even passing arguments through pending intents and stuff. We're using relative layouts, string resources. Um, we have even using dialog fragments. With with argument passing. So I wanted to get experience in not only passing arguments between intents and activities, but actually dialog fragments, which is a little different. As I mentioned before, we are using a Google Map activity, and we're setting and removing markers, and we're using a shared preferences in the database, the SQLite database, to store all of our locations and geofence information, stuff like that. And as indicated, we're using geofencing and therefore using the Google Play API. And then lastly, we're using the audio manager to set the volumes. Um, lastly, the demo. So I will go to the code. So here's the code overall structure. We've got our manifest file up here. We've got the debug manifest file because I had to access mock locations, and um, whenever you are mocking locations in debug mode, you have to have this permission, but that you don't need in regular mode. Some of the other permissions we need to get accounts, we need to read profile, we need to read read contacts, and access the notification policy. This one was actually a tricky one. I realized, or I discovered rather, that if you set a volume to 0, you initiate the do not disturb um, mode, if you will. Um, and once you're in do not disturb mode, you um, your app has to have specific permissions to exit do not disturb mode, which kind of makes sense. You don't want to have an app kind of overriding your do not disturb mode. That's the whole point of do not disturb. Um, so you have to grant the permissions through the manifest. Um, and also, so other things that I did when looking for permission, or rather when asking for permission, I use a notification manager to put a little pop-up to basically ask for permission. And actually, ironically, the way to check for permissions for do not disturb is actually completely different than all the other type of permissions that you would normally do. So that was kind of a cool learning experience. All right, so enough about the background stuff. Let's get to the code. So let's start a Nexus S emulator that I've been typically using. The reason why I like using this particular emulator is that when I get to the keyboard, when I actually have text to input, I can use my computer's keyboard. Whereas I found some of the other emulators, you have to kind of click. You're limited to mimicking a touch. So I really like this. So as I mentioned before, this is protected by email. So if I put in, I think there is I even put valid like email validation. So if I don't put a valid email, it, it tells us that it's not. So let's put in my real email and my real password. I think this is my password. We'll find out. There we go. All right, so we've started. This is a clean emulator. So I've got no location set. So let's set a new location. You know, um, admittedly, the UI is not polished, so I would like some sort of indicator that this is how you add a new location. So it brings up a map activity, and let's send it a location that is near my house. So I can go to here, and it brings me to my location. So there's my house in good old Somersworth, New Hampshire. And let's say I want to make, and this is the typical use case of why I wanted to make this app, but let's say I'm driving to work. I go to work at Liberty Mutual, somewhere around here. So there's Margarita. And here's Liberty Mutual in Dover. And let's say that and here's my office, not measured progress, but this big building right next to it. So let's say if I'm in the office, I want to mute my ringer. Um, so let's say this is the office. So as we can see here, I'm setting up a new location, and I've got several attributes for this location. It's got a name, and it's got the 4 different volumes, and then behind the scenes there's a geo fence, or will be a geo fence associated with this, but there's nothing for the user to input there. So as I mentioned, this is the point of this app is to adjust the volume. So let's say when I enter this geo fence in the office, actually rather, I want it to be muted. So you can see there's the sliders here, so I can set the volume to any volume I want. As a little helper, I say that this is the point that I'm actually setting the geolocation, the geofence to, just so I can see for mocking purposes when I want to actually walk to it. So let's prepare that now. So let's pretend this is preparing to pretend to move. So let's go to 6. And then I found that 4 digits is sufficient to trigger the geo fence. Actually, speaking of that, the geo fence has a radius, and right now I'm using 100 meters, just as a range. Um, Interesting thing about geofencing, I originally started off trying to just use a location listener. Um, the location manager rather, and set up a location listener. And I found very interesting things about. There was quite a cool learning experience about finding or setting up radiuses in using the location manager because of basically the math and the curvature of the Earth. That if you just make a distance between, so if you use location distance between, um, if you just do a typical circle around um, on a curved surface like the Earth, they've found that if you are near the poles, the circle actually becomes distorted and becomes more like an oval, and it doesn't really it has side effects that you don't want based on your distance from the equator. So instead, we are using as I mentioned before, the geofence. API. It's actually even a little easier to use because it already has the pre-built like listeners, so you can know when you are transitioning from a geofence and out of it. If I had continued down the location manager route, I would have had to set up a listener or some sort of background service that was polling to see is my location currently in a geofence or not. So this does that for me. So back to the app. So we're setting up a new location, and I hit save, and in the background it's added a geofence. And so now comes the point in the demo where I was at an impasse. So you'll notice, or after I've noticed or discovered rather, again, quite a learning experience, that when you are emulating a location, um, it is this emulator is actually setting as it notices here, the GPS data point. Unfortunately, the Google Play, the GeoFence service uses a network-based location, or or rather, I should say, I don't know how to force it to use the GPS location. Currently, it uses the network location, and therefore, the only way for me to mock that I'm moving around is to actually move around. Um, Using this GPS movement, it actually doesn't, unfortunately, doesn't trigger. Um, so let's send that I moved. So I used to be over there. I used to be at my house, and now I'm going to simulate that I moved to work. And you can see, so now I'm actually, it's pretending I'm here. So maybe it's a little off. So maybe, I think this is the direction. So there, I'm definitely within 100 yards, 100 meters of it. And unfortunately, the geo transition did not trigger. So what would have happened is this update volumes would have occurred, and it didn't. So what I've done for demo purposes is back to this page where you have your list of your locations. Actually, I'll create one more just to show you that it has a list. So let's make it way out there, out in Europe somewhere. In case I ever go to Europe, let's say I want it full blast. Whatever. Boom, boom, and save. So now I've got two. Okay. Um, as I was mentioning before, this little play button I've added for demo purposes, and what it will do, it will actually kind of simulate the uh, triggering of the geofence and actually just run the same function that the geofence would have ran. The update. Let me go to the location activity. It's going to run this when I get to it. Update location function, or rather, add location function is here. I'm sorry, I need to go to the list. Too many windows open. Go to the list. Here we go. Update volumes. So um, this floating action this floating action button simulate gets the first basically gets the first location out of the database. So it was that work one, and then updates the volume accordingly. So you'll see it's using the audio manager set stream volume. Funny thing about, or I learned that there's not the 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 volumes of a device does not go like 0 to 100%. It's based on these arbitrary integers. So I've actually found that mine goes from 0 to 7. So at first when I was trying to take the slide, and the sliders have a 0 to 100 value. So you get the value on the slider and it'd be like 23%. And then I'd go to set the volume at 23, which was essentially way higher than the max volume. So it just set it to max, and I was very confused at what was going on. So eventually I learned that you have to determine the maximum volume and then take a percentage of that. So that's what these doubles are doing, and then I convert them back to an int. So I do some rounding. Um, so that's how it actually sets the volume. So let's give a little demo of that. So as I mentioned, um, so the office location will be the one that will be mocked or simulated. Oops, back location. There we go. So let's take a look at our volume here. So that one's going to set it to nothing. So or to mute it. So by having its full volume first and I hit play, you'll notice, oh, the do not disturb got hit because we set it to 0. And if you scroll here, all the volumes were set to 0. Um, Conversely, we can edit this volume. We can edit the location to set a different, we can change it, and then we simulate it again, and now my volumes have moved back to the new, or rather to the new settings that I've chosen. So there you have it. It's nothing overly fancy, but I'm quite proud of it. I really think it's going to be useful. I definitely want to try it out in the wild and make it a little more polished, and maybe even offer it in Google Play Store. So maybe coming soon to a Android near you, there will be an app called Volume Buddy. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I hope I didn't go too long. I can be quite verbose sometimes. But thank you. This has been a great semester. It's actually my last semester, so I'll be graduating here. So thanks to all of you. If Anatoly is watching this somehow, thank you very much for your mentorship. This has been an amazing experience, and I'm very thrilled to be graduating. Take care. Bye, everyone.